Near the end of the Second World War, countless Allied pilots recalled the same chilling memory. They were flying in their familiar formation machine guns ready, radar steady, radio links clear, when a metallic blur suddenly ripped past them. It moved so fast that almost no one could turn their head in time to see what it was. It was not a Bf-109, it was not an FW-190. It did not resemble anything the skies over Europe had ever witnessed. And if it had appeared just 1 year earlier, the air map of an entire continent might have been rewritten. It was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter to enter real combat. But its most terrifying aspect was not merely its speed, it was the entirely new philosophy of air warfare it signaled. No more elegant dogfights spiraling through the clouds, only high-velocity dives, fire and breakaways executed in seconds, where a single miscalculation meant death. The question is, how did a nation being bombed to exhaustion manage to create a machine so far ahead of its time, and why did this so-called miracle weapon ultimately become a military revolution born too early? By the year 1943, Nazi Germany was confronting a brutal reality. Its air force was being crushed in the skies directly above its own territory. America's B-17 and B-24 flying fortresses, alongside Britain's Lancaster bombers, struck in relentless waves day and night, pounding industrial hubs, armament plants, and fuel refineries. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were still lethal in the hands of veteran pilots, but they were now outmatched in speed, altitude, range, and above all, sheer numbers. The Allied strategy of breaking an enemy's war machine from the air was finally working, destroy production before the Wehrmacht could use it. Within this context, the German Air Ministry had to confront a cold conclusion. If they continued relying on piston engine fighters, the Luftwaffe would be decisively defeated in the air war, and once the skies were lost, every effort on the ground would simply be delaying collapse. The question was no longer whether to upgrade, but whether to leap ahead or be erased from the sky entirely. Germany, however, was not starting from zero. Just before the war, the Heinkel He-178, an experimental jet aircraft, successfully flew in the month of August of 1939, proving that jet propulsion was no longer science fiction. In the month of April that same year, Messerschmitt received a formal directive, Project P-1065, a jet-powered interceptor requiring a cruising speed above 530 miles per hour, about 850 kilometers per hour, and a minimum endurance of 1 hour, enough for takeoff, climb, interception, and return before fuel depletion. But technological pressure was only half the equation. Germany was now under full war economy strain. Naval blockades and strategic bombing strangled access to fuel and critical metals. A single Me-262 airframe cost roughly 87,400 Reichsmark. Each Jumo 004 engine added another 10,000 Reichsmark. Armament systems, electronics, and labor pushed the real cost far higher. On the other side of the battlefield, every shot-down B-17 represented a massive American financial loss. The calculation, therefore, was not just about performance, it was about cost-exchange ratio. If an extremely expensive Me-262 could reliably bring down 4-engine bombers packed with explosives and trained crews, it could shift the economics of the war. The operational requirement thus became existential. The Luftwaffe needed a platform with absolute speed superiority to punch through escort fighters, tear into bomber formations, deliver a killing blow in seconds, and disengage before the enemy could react. Existing piston fighters had reached their aerodynamic ceiling. Squeezing extra performance from the Bf-109 or FW-190 offered diminishing returns, while the loss of experienced pilots grew severe. The limits of the old generation were unmistakable. Near transonic speeds, straight wings suffered dangerous compressibility effects, airflow shock, buffeting, and heavy control response, especially during dives. Piston engines, no matter how powerful, remained tied to propeller efficiency, which collapsed at high speeds. Meanwhile, B-17 and B-24 formations were increasingly escorted by long-range fighters such as the P-51 Mustang, capable of penetrating deep into German airspace and even pursuing defenders back to their airfields. The Luftwaffe's once decisive maneuverability advantage was evaporating. Thus, the original design philosophy of the Me-262 emerged. Speed is armor. The aircraft needed to outrun every adversary by at least 150 kilometers per hour, climb rapidly, and carry devastating firepower specifically optimized to shred heavy bombers. In exchange, designers accepted the trade-offs: poor low-speed handling, fragile engines, and reduced pilot friendliness. The Me-262 was conceived not as a multi-role aircraft, but as a strategic interceptor, a weapon intended to fracture the Allied bombing campaign. But the journey from blueprint to combat-ready aircraft was anything but smooth. Immature engine technology, shortages of strategic materials, political interference, most notoriously Adolf Hitler's insistence on turning it into a fast fighter bomber, and chaotic logistics repeatedly delayed the program. By the time the Me-262 finally appeared in the skies in the year 1944, it was both a technological wonder and a symbol of a nation already exhausted. And so a crucial question emerges beneath its elegant aerodynamic shape. How different was the Me-262's internal engineering from everything that came before it? That answer lies in the technical dissection awaiting in the next section. Imagine standing beside a wartime runway as a Messerschmitt Me-262 taxis out for takeoff. A low metal fuselage, a long pointed nose, a single seat cockpit up front, and most striking of all, two engine nacelles hanging like steel warheads beneath each wing. This unusual configuration was not an aesthetic choice, but the product of testing cycles, accidents, and hard-learned engineering lessons. Early in development, engineers intended to place the engines inside the wing roots, as many aircraft designers of the era preferred. On paper, it reduced drag and produced a cleaner airframe, but the risk was fatal. If an engine exploded or shed turbine blades, the high-velocity debris could tear through the load-bearing structure and incinerate the pilot in an instant. Moving the engines into external gondolas solved several problems at once. It simplified wing construction, made engine swaps faster for ground crews, and if disaster struck, allowed most of the blast energy to occur outside the central fuselage. It was a design decision born from a blend of performance, maintainability, and survival. The wings of the Me-262 carried a modest leading-edge sweep of roughly 18 to 20 degrees. At the time, Germany did not yet have a fully developed theoretical doctrine for swept wings and transonic airflow. The original reason for the sweep was practical, balancing the center of gravity to compensate for the heavy wing-mounted engines. Yet by accident, this mild sweep dramatically improved high-speed aerodynamic behavior, reducing compressibility effects and giving the aircraft greater stability in the 800 to 870 km/h range, a regime where piston fighters rarely dared to fly. For the pilot in the cockpit, that gentle sweep could mean the difference between a machine that still obeyed control inputs and one shaking itself apart as airflow piled up beneath the wings. At the heart of the Me-262 were its two Junkers Jumo 004B engines, the world's first mass-produced axial flow turbojets. Each engine used a multi-stage axial compressor, an annular combustion chamber, and a single-stage turbine, producing roughly 1,800 kilograms of thrust. But behind that number lay a brutal compromise. Lacking high-temperature alloys, such as nickel and cobalt, German engineers resorted to low-grade steel for turbine blades. The result was a shockingly short service life, sometimes as little as 10 to 25 flight hours, and with meticulous metal inspections, perhaps 35. The Jumo 004 was in many ways a technological flare, brilliant, powerful, but burning out quickly. Yet its simplicity and inexpensive materials allowed thousands of engines to be built rapidly enough to equip both the Me-262 and the Arado R234. This trade-off only became catastrophic when the war dragged on longer than the designers had hoped, something that by the year 1944 was all but inevitable. Operating the Jumo 004 forced pilots to abandon old habits entirely. Abrupt throttle movements at low speed could cause combustion temperatures to spike, overheating turbine blades, snapping them, or igniting the entire engine. Takeoff and climb procedures were therefore rigid. Throttle up slowly, increase acceleration steadily, avoid sudden transitions, and synchronize both engines at all times. In the cockpit, the pilot constantly watched rotational speed, exhaust temperature, and the engine's delayed response, completely unlike the instant power delivery of a piston engine. The Me-262's airframe used stress-skinned duralumin alloy construction with steel components at high stress points such as landing gear mounts and engine supports. Two main fuel tanks of roughly 900 liters sat ahead of and behind the cockpit with an optional belly tank, increasing total capacity to nearly 2,000 to 2,470 liters, depending on configuration. This layout kept the center of gravity stable as fuel burned away, but also turned the area surrounding the pilot into a highly flammable zone, another example of performance taking precedence over protection. Flight controls were entirely mechanical, using cables and levers to actuate ailerons, flaps, and rudder. There was no hydraulic or fly-by-wire assistance of any kind. In high-speed flight, compressibility effects dramatically increased control forces, requiring the pilot to apply significant physical strength and avoid abrupt high-load maneuvers. The tricycle landing gear, nose wheel, retracting backward, mains folding into the wing roots offered excellent runway visibility compared to tail draggers, but demanded higher runway quality during takeoff and landing. Most daytime fighter variants lacked onboard radar, relying instead on radio communication, ground radar vectoring, navigation skills, and the pilot's own eyes. Only night fighter versions carried the bulky FUG 218 radar, whose staghorn antenna array on the nose added drag but allowed target detection in darkness. A typical Me-262 combat sortie was a compressed symphony of jet-era procedures: a ground radar alert, pilots sprinting to their aircraft, ground crews assisting with ignition of the two Jumo engines, checks on rotational speed, temperature, and oil pressure, then taxiing to the runway. The pilot advanced the throttle slowly, lifted off, retracted gear, and climbed at optimal speed. Approaching bomber formations, the Me-262 used its overwhelming speed, roughly 150 kilometers per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang, to dive from above and behind, fire for 1 or 2 seconds, then disengage with a downward brake or high-speed lateral extension. As fuel reached critical levels, the jet had to return immediately, landing on a long, clean runway where mechanics waited to inspect engines, airframe, refuel, and reload for the next scramble. Compared to its contemporaries, the Me-262 represented a comprehensive leap. Axial flow jets instead of piston engines, swept wings instead of straight ones, modern tricycle landing gear, and concentrated nose-mounted weaponry. It was not a case of old airframe, new engine, but a fully integrated system from a new era. Yet all of those technical advantages were ultimately condensed to serve one brutal purpose: delivering maximum destructive power in a few seconds of head-on confrontation with Allied bombers. And to understand just how devastating that firepower truly was, we must examine what the Me-262 carried in its nose. The standard fighter variant, the Me-262A1 Schwalbe, carried in its nose 4 Mk108 30mm autocannons, each with roughly 100 rounds. All of the firepower was concentrated at a single point, no wing guns maximizing accuracy at short engagement distances. Each Mk108 fired about 650 rounds per minute. When all 4 cannons opened up simultaneously, the aircraft could hurl more than 40 30mm shells every second. But what made the Mk108 truly terrifying was not muzzle velocity, which at roughly 540 meters per second was far lower than many contemporary 30mm weapons. Its lethality came from the Menengeschoss shell, a thin-walled projectile packed with an unusually large explosive charge. Against a 4-engine bomber, just 1 or 2 hits in the right place could tear through load-bearing spars, destroy wing sections, or ignite fuel tanks. Allied crews told stories of B-17 bombers that had endured long bursts of 20mm fire only to be literally torn in half after a single short burst from a Me-262. The question was not whether the rounds hit, it was that one hit was enough. Yet the window for firing was brutally short. When a Me-262 dived from above and behind a bomber formation, the relative closing speed could exceed 150 kilometers per hour. The effective range of the Mk108 was only about 500 to 600 meters, and the pilot had to break off at around 200 meters to avoid collision. That left roughly 1 to 2 seconds, the entire golden window, to aim, fire, and prepare to disengage. It demanded exceptional judgment, calmness, and fire discipline. If a pilot simply squeezed the trigger on instinct, he would exhaust his ammunition before doing any real damage. To increase destructive potential during that tiny engagement window, German engineers armed the Me-262 with a unique weapon, the R-4M unguided rocket, 55 millimeters in diameter, carried in clusters of 12 under each wing for a total of 24 rockets. Pilots could launch the entire salvo at bomber formations from beyond 1,000 meters, creating a wall of fragments when the warheads detonated. Even a few rockets exploding in the right place could disrupt tight defensive formations, forcing B-17s to drift apart, opening them to a finishing burst of 30mm fire. Several experimental variants pushed the oversized firepower concept even further. The A1 AU4 version mounted a single BK5 50mm cannon in the nose, essentially a repurposed anti-tank gun under the concept, few shots, maximum destruction. A single hit could destroy a heavy bomber outright, but the massive recoil, added weight, and difficult handling made the configuration impractical for widespread use. When compared to its contemporaries, the difference becomes unmistakable. The American P-51 Mustang carried 6 12.7mm machine guns, ideal for escort, dogfighting, and wearing down targets. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 of the same, emphasizing sustained fire. Britain's Gloucester Meteor mounted 4 20mm cannons. Against these configurations, the Me-262's quartet of 30mm cannons was optimized for one mission only, destroying multi-ton steel bombers in a single brief pass. As for targeting systems, the Me-262 had no radar or electronic gun sights of the kind that would appear after the war. Pilots used a basic optical sight, estimated lead angles by experience, and relied on ground controllers for vectoring. There was no electronic warfare, no guided missiles. The modernity of the Me-262 lay in its engines and its firepower. Its sensors were fundamentally manual. By contrast, the Allies leveraged ground radar networks and coordinated command and control to ambush Me-262s at their greatest vulnerability, the airspace around their airfields. In ammunition design, the Luftwaffe accepted the drawback of low muzzle velocity in exchange for a lighter cannon and vastly more explosive power. They abandoned the idea of turning the Me-262 into a dogfighter against the P-51. Instead, they shaped it into a strategic executioner for the B-17 and B-24 approach from the right angle, unleash destruction in seconds and vanish before escort fighters could react. But to keep such a complex, fragile, and expensive machine flying in wartime conditions, Germany needed an entirely new logistical ecosystem, and it was there that the Me-262's technical brilliance collided with hard reality. To operate a squadron of Me-262s effectively, the Luftwaffe needed far more than a row of jets parked along a runway. Each aircraft dragged behind it an entire invisible army. Dedicated Jumo 004 engine technicians, airframe specialists, weapons crews, radio teams, fuel handlers, ground radar operators, and airfield security units. In the early phase of deployment, nearly 20 personnel could be required to support just one aircraft before procedures were standardized. Maintenance cycles were dictated entirely by the material limitations of the Jumo 004. After every flight, the engines had to be inspected for temperature fluctuations, vibration levels, oil leaks, and microscopic signs of turbine blade cracking. After only 10 to 25 hours of use, many engines had to be removed for deeper inspection or replaced whether they appeared functional or not. Low-grade materials saved scarce nickel and cobalt, but forced the logistical system into a relentless maintenance loop, requiring large spare parts inventories and highly skilled technicians, all while factories were being bombed continuously. Pilot training became another bottleneck. Transitioning from piston fighters to jets was not simply flying faster, it meant learning throttle lag, different acceleration behavior, and unfamiliar aircraft responses near transonic speeds. By the final years of the war, the Luftwaffe lacked time, fuel, and two-seat trainers. The Me-262B1A, the dual-control trainer, existed only in small numbers. Many young pilots effectively jumped straight from the BF-109 or Fluk-190 into the Me-262 after only a few hours of theoretical instruction and minimal flight time. The result was a high rate of takeoff and landing accidents even before encountering Allied aircraft. Field conditions restricted the jet even further. The engines were extremely sensitive to foreign object ingestion. The runway had to be smooth, clean paved, very unlike the rough forward airstrips that piston fighters could still use. A single stone, a stray piece of metal, or unexploded bomb fragment could be sucked into the intake, shatter the turbine blades, and turn the expensive jet into a fireball on the spot. Rain and mud, winter ice and snow, or runways cratered by bombs, all could be more dangerous to the Me-262 than an entire flight of P-51 Mustangs. Temperature was another constant threat. Cold weather thickened engine oil, making starts difficult. Hot weather pushed turbine metals toward overheating. In short, the Me-262 was a high-quality airfield weapon, poorly suited to the flexible, rugged network of forward bases that gave the Allies enormous operational advantage. Fuel logistics came with their own burden. The Jumo 004 could burn synthetic jet fuel produced from lignite coal or diluted oil blends, reducing dependence on high-octane gasoline. But consumption was vastly higher than piston engines, severely limiting combat radius without auxiliary tanks. Every hour of Me-262 flight time was not just engine power. It was a withdrawal from fuel stockpiles, spare parts, manpower hours, and operational time across the entire support system. In terms of rearming, concentrating all cannons in the nose was an advantage. Loading, alignment, and inspection were more centralized compared to wing-mounted guns. The R-4M rockets were loaded in pre-assembled racks, but the process required strict discipline due to the sensitivity of the warheads. Night fighter variants carrying radar had to accept bulky antenna arrays that increased drag, forcing commanders to choose between nighttime interception capability and optimal daytime performance. The Me-262's full lifecycle cost was therefore enormous. Each airframe required thousands of labor hours to produce, not including engines, weapons, or electronics. Add the cost of pilot training, maintenance crews, airfield defense, and constant attrition from bombing raids, and the Me-262 emerged as a strategic asset that was both powerful and fragile. It was a master swordsman that could fight brilliantly, but only inside a very specific arena. A runway still intact, logistics still flowing, fuel still available, and skies not yet fully controlled by the enemy. So under the chaos of real combat, while Allied bombs were falling even on those very runways, what did the Me-262 actually achieve? The Me-262 first entered combat in experimental form in the summer of the year 1944 under the Special Unit Commando Nowotny, named after the ace pilot Walter Nowotny. From the very first engagements, the aircraft's terrifying potential became obvious. In some sorties, the Me-262 closed in so rapidly that P-51 Mustangs could barely pivot in time to react. In the year 2025, something unfolded over Ukraine that most air defense officers had spent 3 decades insisting was impossible. Ukrainian radar operators began reporting readings that defied every conventional expectation. Russian K-101 and Caliber cruise missiles were not falling to Patriot interceptors, not to Iris-T, and not to any of the multi-million euro defensive missiles designed for such threats. They were being torn apart midair by a 35mm gun, a system that many NATO officers had long dismissed as a low-cost counter-drone asset, suddenly stepped into the center of long-range warfare. Skynex, Rheinmetall'S networked air defense gun system, quietly achieved what even Moscow had not prepared itself to confront: the destruction of Russia's most sophisticated cruise missiles using bursts of ammunition costing only a few thousand euros per shot. While international media focused on Patriot, NASAMS, Iris-T, SL, and the dramatic theater of long-range interceptors, a supposedly secondary system was quietly rewriting the economics of aerial warfare. Inside Russian Air Force command centers, Kh-101 strikes launched from 295 MS bombers deep inside Russian territory, often thousands of kilometers from their targets, had long been considered clean strikes. They were designed to be fired from beyond reach, fly low, hug the terrain, slip under radar coverage, and force the defender to burn through their inventory of expensive interceptors. Yet suddenly the lost charts revealed gaps that made no sense. Missiles that should have reached their targets simply vanished. There were no signatures of surface-to-air missile impacts, no signs of electronic warfare diversion. They simply disappeared into what looked, on radar screens, like a cloud of invisible shrapnel. In Brussels, Ramstein, and Paris, NATO officers initially wrote it off as statistical noise in a chaotic battle space. No one wanted to believe that a 35mm gun, something many Cold War manuals considered an artifact of a bygone era, could pose a genuine threat to modern long-range strike weapons. But after action reports from Ukraine, along with commercial satellite imagery and even grainy footage from civilian security cameras, began forming a picture that was impossible to ignore. The flame trails of Russian cruise missiles were breaking apart exactly where Skynex systems had been deployed. Each time it happened, the cost exchange equation hit the Kremlin like a direct slap. Millions spent on a cruise missile, defeated by a few thousand euros in programmable ammunition and a gun battery still ready to fire its next burst. The shock finally erupted into the open at the end of 2025. During an investor briefing, Rheinmetall Chief Executive Officer Armin Paperger inadvertently confirmed what Kyiv had kept quiet for months. Skynex in Ukraine was not only destroying Shahed drones, it had intercepted Ka-101 and Caliber missiles in real combat. Open source intelligence networks moved quickly to verify his claim. Defense Express, United 24 Media, and independent satellite analysis groups all converged on the same conclusion. On the battlefield, at least part of Russia's cruise missile losses had come from a system the Kremlin never considered a strategic threat: anti-aircraft guns. For Ukraine, this was more than a technical victory. It reversed the entire economic framework of long-range warfare. For years, Western doctrine had rested on the assumption that cruise missiles existed primarily to force defenders to expend even more expensive interceptors. Patriot, Aster, SM-6, Iris, TSL, each launch represented hundreds of thousands to several million euros. When Russia planned its campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure, it assumed that the sheer cost of defending the grid would exhaust Kyiv and Europe. Yet, a single Skynex battery, with thousands of programmable 35mm rounds, began ripping that calculation apart. Operationally, the impact cut even deeper. What once required volleys of medium and long-range interceptors could now be pushed down to gun systems. The very characteristics that had once made Kh-101 and Caliber dangerous low-altitude, terrain-hugging, subsonic flight suddenly turned them into ideal prey in the final kilometers of Skynex engagement range. A missile designed to slip under radar became a target walking straight into a kill zone. For Russian strategists, the danger was not the loss of a few dozen missiles. It was the question behind those losses. If a 35mm gun can do this in Ukraine, what happens when NATO deploys dozens or even hundreds of similar systems across its eastern frontier and around strategic air bases? The entire concept of deep precision strike from beyond reach, the foundation of modern Russian and Chinese missile doctrine, now faced a brutal dilemma. How do you defeat a defender who can shoot down your weapons with ammunition instead of missiles? Leaked fragments of classified assessments revealed a phrase appearing repeatedly inside NATO planning circles: cost asymmetric warfare. In this new logic, Skynex was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of a shifting paradigm. The question was no longer who could build the longest range, fastest, or most expensive missile. It was who could defend their airspace for less. And to understand why a gun can rip apart a cruise missile in midair and shake the foundations of long-range strike doctrine, we have to look inside the barrel itself. Inside the 35mm round that transformed Skynex into the cruise missile grinder of the Ukrainian battlefield, there, the story is no longer about hitting or missing. It is about an integrated architecture of sensors, algorithms, and programmable munitions designed for one purpose only: to turn every low-altitude corridor into a dead zone. To understand why Skynex can destroy cruise missile systems specifically engineered to pierce NATO-grade air defenses, we must look at the technical core of the system, the 35mm A-head round. This is not conventional ammunition. It is a programmable kill device, a microcharge with an electronic brain created for one purpose only: to slice apart any low-flying target at the exact moment required. In modern warfare, where reaction time is measured in milliseconds, this round is the difference between interception and penetration. Before the projectile even leaves the barrel of the Oerlikon revolver gun Mine 3, an electromagnetic induction coil positioned at the muzzle programs its electronic timer. The process takes less than 1/1000th of a second, fast enough to accommodate real-time changes in the target's movement. Skynex's fire control network continuously computes crossing speed, altitude, angle of approach, and projected flight path. For cruise missiles like the KH-101 and Caliber, those parameters remain remarkably stable. Subsonic speeds between Mach 0.57 and Mach 0.76, and terrain-hugging flight profiles at approximately 30 to 70 meters because of that stability. Skynex does not chase the missile, it leads the missile. The round detonates precisely ahead of the flight path, releasing a forward projected cone of 152 tungsten projectiles, an ultrafast metal burst that impacts the missile head-on. When this conical cloud reaches the target, the missile does not explode, it physically collapses. Control fins are severed, GPS and GLONASS navigation units are mechanically disrupted, optical and infrared sensors are torn from their housing, and air inlets deform instantly. Within 4 to 8 milliseconds, the missile loses aerodynamic stability, enters uncontrollable roll, and fractures midair. A journey of several hundred kilometers is erased by a burst of ammunition costing only a few thousand euros. Against hypersonic or near hypersonic threats like the P-800 Onyx, which travels at more than Mach 2, the picture changes. Speed compresses the engagement window, the time to intercept, to merely 2 to 4 seconds. This is why Ukraine achieved a strikingly low interception rate of 5.7% using gun systems against Onyx, but KH-101 and Caliber belong to a different category. They fly low to avoid radar, yet that same low altitude exposes them to the densest portion of the gun's kill envelope, the lethal 2 to 4 kilometer terminal zone where few other systems can react fast enough. Still, ammunition alone does not tell the whole story. What turns Skynex into a missile hunter is not only the A-head round, but the networked sensor architecture behind it. Here lies the advantage for which Russia has no workable answer. A full Skynex battery consists of a long-range surveillance radar with a detection radius of up to 50 kilometers, an automated fire control center, tactical data links, and 4 35mm gun units. Each gun has its own X-band tracking radar and an independent electro-optical and infrared sight. No blind spots, no single point of failure. No central node that can be knocked out with a single jamming strike. If the primary radar is jammed, each gun's radar continues to track independently. If bad weather degrades electro-optical sensors, X-band frequencies cut through heavy cloud layers. If one gun loses line of sight due to terrain, the remaining three compensate instantly. This is the multi-node fire control doctrine that NATO began adopting in 2022 for integrated air and missile defense. Russia, by contrast, still relies on a centralized model in which the main radar carries most of the guidance burden. Skynex operates differently. It is a distributed network. To blind it, an attacker must simultaneously neutralize every sensor, a task well beyond the capability of current Russian jamming systems. Once the target is confirmed, the Skynex engagement chain unfolds with extraordinary speed, approximately 4.5 seconds from detection to fire. This matters because KH-101 and caliber typically appear on short-range radar very late, only seconds before entering the defended zone. Even advanced systems such as Patriot PAC-2 or PAC-3 are optimized for high-altitude corridors, not for last-second low-altitude subsonic penetration within inland terrain. Here we see the first clear fracture in Russia's strike doctrine. Moscow assumed that layered saturation decoys, drones, and cruise missiles would force Ukraine to expend medium and long-range interceptors. But Skynex does not fire missiles. It fires programmable shells. And in a single battery, 4 independent guns can engage 4 separate targets simultaneously, something few medium or long-range systems can do at comparable cost. The result is stark. Russia spends between 2 million and 4 million euros per cruise missile. Ukraine spends a few thousand euros to tear it apart. The cost differential becomes a direct strike against the financial structure of Russia's long-range warfare model. It is not a glamorous victory. It is not a technological showcase. It is the collapse of Moscow's battlefield economics, a collapse they did not anticipate. But to understand Skynex fully, we must return to its origins, and those origins begin with a vehicle that Russia once mocked without restraint, the Gepard. The origin of Skynex did not begin in a modern laboratory. It began with a self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicle that Moscow openly mocked throughout the years, 2022 and 2023, the Gepard. In the early months of Russia's expanded campaign, marked by waves of Shahed drones and volleys of KH-55, KH-101, and caliber missiles, the Gepard was widely dismissed in the West as a Cold War relic, a system too old and too limited for modern warfare. And yet, that same platform, with its twin 35mm radar-guided cannons, proved that Russia's strategic assumptions were fundamentally flawed. Frontline footage and independent OSINT investigations showed that Gepard had directly shot down KH-101 missiles, systems that Russian doctrine claimed were impossible to defeat with guns. That single event should have forced the Russian General Staff to reassess their entire low-altitude strike doctrine. They did not because they were unaware, but because they refused to believe it. Russian state media quickly labeled Gepard's success as a rare stroke of luck, insisting that a 30-year-old platform could not possibly threaten new generation cruise missiles. Russian planners held firm to the assumption that subsonic missiles were smart enough, low enough, and stealthy enough to slip past any gun-based defense. That misplaced confidence prevented them from preparing for the Gepard's successor, a successor Rheinmetall had quietly developed over nearly 2 decades. That successor was Skynex. Skynex is not Gepard 2.0. It is the complete rebirth of the idea that you stop an expensive threat with cheaper firepower, but elevate it onto a fully networked sensor architecture with real-time automated algorithms. Gepard demonstrated that a gun can down a cruise missile. Skynex demonstrated that a gun system can do it on demand repeatably, sustainably, and at scale without the prohibitive ammunition costs that plague missile interceptors. With Gepard, each engagement was a skill-dependent event. With Skynex, every engagement is an outcome predicted by mathematics and data. What transforms the concept entirely is the sensor network architecture that Gepard never had. Gepard relied on a single vehicle-mounted radar and a 1980s-era fire control system. Skynex operates within a distributed environment. Long-range surveillance radar, battery-level radar, individual X-band tracking radars on each gun, electro-optical and infrared sensors, a centralized fire control computer, and integrated tactical data links. In other words, if Gepard was a pair of eyes, Skynex is an entire neural network. And in modern warfare, the side with the stronger neural network holds the advantage. Yet the most decisive difference between Gepard and Skynex lies in their operational employment, an area Ukraine exploited to maximum effect. Gepard was used to patch gaps, deployed in places where long-range systems could not react quickly enough due to reload cycles or engagement geometry. Skynex, however, was deployed as a dedicated mid-layer defense, an unavoidable barrier that every attacking vector had to pass through. Shaheds, Lancets, UMPK glide bombs, KH-101, KH-55, and Caliber missiles all had to cross its engagement envelope. It became the connective tissue between long-range interceptors and point defense units, creating a continuous dead zone that Russian weapons had to breach to reach air bases, power plants, logistics hubs, command centers, and strategic rail nodes. Between 2024 and 2025, Russia tested multiple tactics to bypass Gepard and Skynex, increasing decoy numbers, using low-cost one-way attack drones to saturate sensors, deploying UMPK bombs along new corridors, and even flying cruise missiles around higher terrain to break gun intercept geometry. Every tactic failed for the same reason. Skynex does not operate alone. It operates as part of a network, and networks are not defeated by a single trick. Gepard created a surprise, Skynex created a strategic crisis. For if a 30-year-old platform could shoot down modern cruise missiles, what could a new generation system with stronger radar, better tracking, faster algorithms, and more precise, programmable ammunition achieve? That question began to haunt Russian military leadership in early 2025. What they feared most was not Ukraine possessing a handful of Skynex units. What truly kept them awake at night was the possibility that Europe could deploy hundreds. And at that moment, another dimension of the story began to reveal itself: the role of Skynex within the layered air defense structure that Ukraine was forced to build in order to survive the largest long-range strike campaign in Europe since the Second World War. As Russia increased the tempo of missile, drone, and glide bomb attacks between 2023 and 2025, Ukraine was forced to build an air defense network with no modern precedent in Europe. No country on the continent had ever faced hundreds of low-flying targets each month, synchronized through saturation tactics that combined decoys, one-way attack drones, loitering munitions, UMPK glide bombs, and subsonic cruise missiles. Patriot, NASAMS, IRIS-T, SL, and SAMP divided by T formed only the tip of the pyramid. Beneath them lay a dangerous void, an altitude band where Russian cruise missiles repeatedly broke through in the early months of the war. Into that void, Skynex entered and sealed it shut with a low-cost, high-efficiency layer of lethal coverage. Each tier in Ukraine's defense network performs a different function. The highest tier, Patriot Pack 2, Patriot Pack 3, and SAMP divided by T, is optimized for long-range, high-speed, or strategic threats such as the Iskander-M, KH-22, Kinzhal, or tactical aircraft. The mid-tier, where NASAMS, IRIS-TSL, and Legacy Book M1 operate, engages major threats that require robust interceptors but do not demand the power of high-altitude systems. Skynex occupies the mid-low tier, the tier that determines interception performance in the daily reality of a country under constant attack. This is the tier with the greatest volume of threats, the most moderate speeds, and the area where Russia invests the most into its concept of defense exhaustion through quantity. Skynex is integrated directly into Ukraine's command, control, communications, computer, and ISR architecture. It receives data from long-range surveillance radars, reconnaissance drones, electro-optical sensors from ground forces, and even counter-battery radars. All these feeds converge into command centers. Near the end of the Second World War, countless Allied pilots recalled the same chilling memory. They were flying in their familiar formation machine guns ready, radar steady, radio links clear, when a metallic blur suddenly ripped past them. It moved so fast that almost no one could turn their head in time to see what it was. It was not a Bf-109, it was not an FW-190. It did not resemble anything the skies over Europe had ever witnessed. And if it had appeared just 1 year earlier, the air map of an entire continent might have been rewritten. It was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter to enter real combat. But its most terrifying aspect was not merely its speed, it was the entirely new philosophy of air warfare it signaled. No more elegant dogfights spiraling through the clouds, only high-velocity dives, fire and breakaways executed in seconds, where a single miscalculation meant death. The question is, how did a nation being bombed to exhaustion manage